The Galactic Council had one rule that everyone knew, and everyone followed without question or doubt or hesitation, because it was simply the way things worked in the universe, and that rule was simple and clear and absolute in its truth, which stated that faster-than-light travel required exotic matter and dimensional manipulation and computational power that only the most advanced species could achieve after spending thousands of years developing the necessary technology and understanding the complex mathematics behind warping space and time itself. So when the human vessel called TRS Defiance dropped out of what looked like a crude and unstable warp field at the edge of Corvani space, the patrol ships didn't know whether to laugh at the ridiculous sight before them, or sound every alarm they had because something impossible was happening right in front of their sensors and instruments. Commander Valix of the Corvani Defense Fleet stared at his display screen with all four of his eyes focused on the readings that couldn't possibly be correct, because the ship that had just appeared was leaking radiation from at least 7 different points along its damaged and patched hull, and the power signature was jumping up and down like a dying star, and the structural integrity was so low that a strong solar wind might tear it apart. Yet somehow this terrible excuse for a spaceship had just crossed 12 light years in a matter of weeks, which should have been completely impossible for a species that had only been in space for 300 years, according to the brief intelligence report that was now flashing on his secondary screen. The ship itself looked like someone had taken spare parts from a junkyard and welded them together, without any concern for proper engineering or safety protocols or basic aesthetic design principles, because the hull was covered in mismatched metal plates of different colors and types, and there were exposed conduits running along the outside like mechanical veins carrying fluids and power and data to various systems that looked like they had been added as afterthoughts, and there were what appeared to be chemical thrusters bolted onto a frame that had no business supporting such equipment, and the whole thing was spinning slightly, as if the attitude control system wasn't working properly, or maybe didn't exist at all. Inside the Defiance, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge with his arms crossed over his chest as he watched the alien ships move into defensive positions around his vessel, and he could see the tension in the shoulders and backs of his crew, of 43 people who had been living in this barely functional ship for 6 months now, and who knew every strange sound and smell and vibration that indicated whether something was working normally or about to explode in their faces, and this moment right here was what they had been traveling toward for so long. And now that it had arrived, Jake felt a strange mixture of pride and terror, because humanity was about to make first contact with an alien civilization, and they were doing it in a ship that was held together with duct tape and hope, and the occasional prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes sat at the communications station with her fingers moving across the controls as she tried to sort through the dozens of different signals that were coming from the alien ships, because apparently they were broadcasting on multiple frequencies at once as if they couldn't decide which one the humans might be monitoring, or perhaps they were just testing to see which frequencies would get through. And Sophie smiled slightly because the answer was all of them, since the human communication system was designed to pick up anything and everything within range, even if it meant processing a lot of noise and interference along with the actual signals. Jake straightened his uniform, which was really just a simple navy blue jumpsuit, with captain's insignia sewn onto the shoulders, and he knew it would look primitive and basic compared to whatever these aliens wore. But it was clean, and it represented Earth and humanity, and that would have to be enough for now. So he took a deep breath and nodded to Sophie, who opened the communication channel, and suddenly the view screen flickered to life, showing a being that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a dolphin and given it translucent blue skin and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on its head. The translation system that humanity had built based on mathematical principles and universal constants began working on the alien's words, though there was a noticeable delay between when the alien spoke and when the translated words appeared as text on the screen and played through the audio system, in a flat mechanical voice that said, the alien was Commander Valix, and he was demanding to know who they were and how they had achieved faster-than-light capability, and why they had entered Corvani space without permission or authorization or any kind of advance warning. Jake smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes because he knew this conversation was going to be difficult and strange, and potentially dangerous depending on how these aliens reacted to the truth. So he spoke clearly and calmly as, He introduced himself as Captain Jake Morrison of the Terran research ship Defiance, representing the United Earth Coalition, and he said they came in peace and meant no harm or intrusion, and as for how they got here, well, that was going to take some explaining because even the humans didn't fully understand why their ship worked, when all the mathematics said it shouldn't. Commander Velix's mandibles clicked together in what might have been frustration or confusion, or perhaps just the alien equivalent of raising an eyebrow in disbelief, as he pointed out that the human vessel was radiating enough exotic particles to poison a small moon, and the hull integrity was barely above 60%, and the reactor was operating at temperatures that should have vaporized the ship 3 times over by now, and yet somehow the humans claimed to have traveled here intentionally, as if this was all part of some kind of plan. Jake had to admit that intentionally might be too strong a word, because there had been a lot of trial and error involved in getting the Defiance operational, and the first 3 test flights had ended with the ship appearing several million miles away from where they had intended to go, and the 4th test had resulted in them spending 2 weeks making emergency repairs in deep space while trying not to suffocate or freeze or get cooked by radiation leaks, but eventually they had figured out how to aim the ship in roughly the right direction and keep it from falling apart during the journey. And here they were standing at the edge of alien space, asking for permission to come closer and maybe learn a few things about this whole galactic civilization that Earth had just discovered existed. What Commander Velix didn't know, and what no one in the galaxy could possibly understand without seeing it for themselves, was that the Defiance represented something unique to humanity, which was the ability to make impossible things work through. Sheer stubbornness and creative problem-solving and a willingness to ignore what the textbook said was impossible, because if you never tried the impossible things, then you would never discover that some of them were actually possible after all, if you just approached them from a different angle, or used materials in ways they weren't designed for or accepted, that sometimes things worked, even when you couldn't explain why. Jake asked permission to approach their nearest station, and he added that his crew would really appreciate the chance to drink something that wasn't recycled from their own wastewater, and maybe exchange some information and establish diplomatic relations between their species, because that seemed like the kind of thing you were supposed to do when you met aliens for the first time. And he tried to sound confident and friendly, even though his ship was barely holding together and his crew was exhausted. And there was a very real chance that these aliens might decide humans were too dangerous or too stupid to be allowed to continue existing. The communication channel went silent for what felt like a very long time, and Jake imagined the discussion that must be happening on the other end with alien officers and advisors, trying to figure out what to do about this impossible human ship that had appeared in their space without warning, and he knew they must be confused and probably a little bit scared, because the humans had done something that shouldn't be possible, and that always made people nervous regardless of what species they belonged to. Finally, Commander Velix returned to the screen and gave them permission to approach the orbital station, but with the condition that they would be escorted by armed ships, and their vessel would be quarantined until the Corvani could determine how much of a hazard it posed to station integrity, and Jake thought that was more than fair given the circumstances. So he thanked the commander and turned to his helmsman Pete Donovan, who had been an asteroid miner before joining the Defiance crew and who could fly just about anything with thrusters and a basic control system. As the Defiance limped toward the massive orbital station ahead, surrounded by sleek alien warships that looked like they had been designed by artists and engineers working together in perfect harmony, Jake allowed himself a moment of pride because humanity had just arrived on the galactic stage, and they had done it in a ship that defied all logic and reason and proper engineering principles, and they had done it with a crew of ordinary people who refused to accept that something was impossible, just because the mathematics said it was, and now nothing would. The quarantine dock at Corvani Station Theta was designed to contain hazardous materials and leaking fuel cores and occasionally biological threats that needed to be isolated from the general population, but it had never been designed to contain something that was all 3 of these things at once while somehow remaining operational and capable of supporting life. And Chief Engineer Lucy Grant stood in the engine room of the Defiance, looking at the mess of cables and pipes and improvised equipment that made up the ship's propulsion system, while knowing that on the other side of the observation window There were a dozen alien scientists and engineers staring at her ship like it was some kind of impossible magic trick that they couldn't figure out. Lucy could see them through the thick, transparent barrier that separated the quarantine dock from the station proper, and she could see their instruments and scanners pointed at the Defiance, and she could imagine the readings they were getting, which probably made no sense according to their understanding of physics and engineering, and she smiled because this was exactly the reaction she had expected when they had first proposed building a faster-than-light ship using theories that had been rejected by every major scientific institution on Earth. Through her communication unit, she heard a voice that was heavily processed by the translation system, and it introduced itself as Senior Engineer Tharik of the Corvani Research Division, and he said that his team had been analyzing the Defiance's energy signature for 3 hours now, and he had to confess that he didn't understand how anyone aboard the ship was still alive, given the radiation levels and temperature variations and structural instabilities that their instruments were detecting. Lucy tapped the communication panel on her wrist and told him that humans got that reaction a lot, and she asked if he wanted to come aboard the ship because it might be easier to explain everything if he could see the systems up close instead of just reading scanner data from a distance. And there was a long pause before Tharik mentioned the radiation levels again, and Lucy interrupted him to point out that the radiation was within acceptable human tolerance since the crew had been living in the ship for 6 months, and surely the Corvani had hazard suits that could protect them for a few hours. An hour later, Lucy found herself giving a tour to 5 alien engineers who looked like they were experiencing some kind of collective nightmare as they examined the Defiance's systems, and Tharik kept running his scanning device over every surface and cable and pipe, while the readings apparently contradicted everything he had been taught in whatever alien engineering schools existed, and he stopped at one point to stare at what looked like a garden hose wrapped in copper wire. Tharik asked if this conduit was really channeling plasma at 12,000 degrees through a coolant system that appeared to be using nothing more sophisticated than water, and Lucy corrected him by saying it was distilled water with a proprietary additive that she called the Grant Special, though mostly it was just water with some dissolved salts to improve conductivity and heat transfer, and she could see the alien engineer's translator struggling to process this information. An insectoid engineer named Zixik started clicking her mandibles rapidly, which Lucy had learned was a sign of extreme agitation or distress, and the alien pointed out that the thermal differential between the plasma and the water should create explosive decompression, and the plasma should eat through the containment in seconds, and the whole system should have failed catastrophically the first time they turned it on. Lucy patted the pipe affectionately like it was a pet that had done something clever, and she explained that yes, the system should fail, but it didn't, because the plasma flow was uneven and pulsing instead of steady, and the water circulation was timed to match those pulses, so the coolant never stayed in one place long enough to boil completely, and it was constantly moving through the system, absorbing heat in one section, while the previous section cycled through a radiator that they had built from old solar panel frames. A gelatinous being whose name the translator couldn't properly process stated flatly that this wasn't possible, because the timing precision required for such a system would need computers more advanced than anything the humans should have, and Lucy explained that the timing was handled by an algorithm that their AI specialist Sam Richardson had coded, and he had based it on Earth jazz music because something about improvisation and syncopation created better flow patterns than rigid mathematical models. Tharik's 4 eyes all focused on Lucy at once, and he asked slowly if she was seriously telling him that the ship's critical cooling system was controlled by musical algorithms, and Lucy said that when he put it like that it sounded kind of weird, but it worked, so what did it matter how strange the solution seemed as long as it kept the ship from melting or exploding or both? They moved deeper into the engineering section, where the reactor core pulsed with an unsettling blue-green light that made Lucy's skin tingle even through her protective suit, and the alien engineers stopped at the threshold of the reactor room, while their scanners started chirping urgent warnings about radiation and unstable energy fields and probability matrices that were apparently breaking down in the presence of whatever was happening inside that chamber. Tharik spoke very slowly and carefully, as he observed that the reactor was operating on principles that Corvani civilization had deemed impossible 4,000 years ago, because the containment field geometry was wrong, and the fuel mixture was inefficient, and the power output fluctuated wildly between dangerous extremes. and yet somehow it was producing enough energy to punch holes in space-time and drag a 43-person crew across 12 light-years. Lucy walked right up to the reactor housing and rested her hand on the warm metal surface that vibrated slightly under her palm. And she told the aliens that she would be completely honest with them, because there was no point in pretending the humans fully understood what they had built. And the truth was the reactor was based on theories from a physicist named Dr. Helen Wright, who had spent 30 years being laughed out of every academic institution on Earth. Zixik asked why this Helen Wright had been dismissed from academic institutions, and Lucy said simply that it was because her mathematics were wrong, and her equations had errors, and her assumptions violated established physics. But she had built a small-scale test model anyway, and it had worked, so the humans had scaled it up and fixed the parts that exploded during testing, and kept the parts that didn't explode, and now they had a functional faster-than-light ship. Tharik's translator seemed to struggle with his next words, and he finally managed to ask if the humans had really built an interstellar drive based on incorrect mathematics. And Lucy corrected him by saying they had built an interstellar drive that worked. And the mathematics were supposed to describe reality, not the other way around, so if reality didn't match the textbooks, then maybe the textbooks were incomplete. The alien engineers exchanged looks that transcended species barriers. And Lucy recognized the universal expression of professionals encountering something that broke every rule they held sacred. And she gestured toward the warp drive assembly that dominated the back section of the engineering bay. And she told them there was more they needed to see. Lucy explained that the aliens had probably noticed that the Defiance didn't use exotic matter for space-time manipulation. And Tharik confirmed quietly that yes, they had noticed, because the ship's drive was creating stable warp bubbles using nothing more than synchronized electromagnetic pulses and rotating gravitational lenses made from compressed iron and rare earth magnets, which shouldn't be possible. Lucy said that was exactly right because the humans couldn't figure out how to manufacture or contain exotic matter with their current technology level, so they just hadn't bothered, and instead they had found a different way to bend space using equipment and materials they could actually produce, and yes, it was less efficient and burned through fuel at an alarming rate. But it worked. And that was what mattered. The gelatinous engineer insisted again that this shouldn't work, and Lucy shrugged and said, yeah, but it did work. And that was humanity in a nutshell, because humans were really good at making things that shouldn't work, actually work. And their entire industrial revolution had been built on steam engines that early scientists said violated thermodynamics, and their digital age had started with computers that theorists claimed would need to be the size of cities. As if the universe wanted to prove her point, an alarm suddenly started blaring through the engineering section, and Lucy glanced at her diagnostic display and sighed, and walked over to a panel that was covered in warning lights, and she opened it to reveal a mess of wires that seemed to be organized by color alone with no other apparent logic. And she pulled out one wire and blew on the connector, and plugged it back in, and the alarm stopped. Lucy explained to the horrified alien engineers that it was just a loose connection that happened every few hours, and they had it on the repair list. But there were always more urgent things to fix first, and Tharik's scanning device had apparently stopped working completely because it was overwhelmed by the contradictory data it was receiving from every surface and system. Tharik stated what seemed obvious to him, which was that the human ship was held together. The diplomatic quarters aboard Corvani Station Theta were luxurious by any standard, with artificial gravity that felt natural, and recycled atmosphere that didn't taste like metal, and beds that weren't bolted to the floor. But Captain Jake Morrison barely noticed any of these comforts because he was too focused on the data streaming across his tablet, which showed reports from Earth Command that had taken 6 days to reach him, even using the quantum-entangled communication system that was supposed to be instantaneous but apparently had delays built into it for reasons the physicists couldn't quite explain. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of something that the station's food synthesizers claimed was coffee, though it tasted nothing like actual coffee, but it did have caffeine, and that was close enough for people who had been drinking recycled water for 6 months, and she told Jake that Earth Command wanted to know if they had made the situation worse. Jake accepted the cup and asked what situation she meant, and Sophie settled into the chair across from him, and said she meant first contact and the diplomatic implications, and basically everything, because apparently there were riots back on Earth, with half the population thinking the Defiance crew had provoked an interstellar war, and the other half thinking humanity was about to be enslaved by superior aliens and nobody seemed to think this was going to end well. Jake muttered that this sounded about right for human reactions to new situations, and he took a sip of the not coffee and grimaced at the taste and asked what the real situation was here on the station. And Sophie pulled up her own tablet to display a political map of the local sector with different colors representing different alien civilizations and their territories. Sophie explained that the situation was mixed with some species being fascinated by humanity, and some being terrified, and most just being confused about how humans had achieved faster than light travel so quickly. And the Corvani were cautious, but curious since they were the local power with 300 colony worlds and 8,000 years of spacefaring experience, and they were mainly worried that humans were going to blow themselves up and take a chunk of Corvani space with them. When it happened, Jake admitted that was a fair concern given how the Defiance looked and operated, and Sophie continued her briefing by highlighting a cluster of systems in green which represented the Viridian Collective, who were apparently the scientists and philosophers of this region, and they wanted to study humanity like humans were some kind of cosmic anomaly, which, to be fair, they kind of were. Jake asked about the bad news, and Sophie's expression darkened as she highlighted another region in red, which represented the Zaros Dominion, and she explained that they were a military empire with a history of conquest dating back 2,000 years, and they had been quiet lately because they had run into species powerful enough to push back, but now they were interested in humanity for all the wrong reasons. Jake guessed that the Zaros saw humans as primitive and easy to exploit, but Sophie shook her head and said it was worse than that, because the Zaros saw human technology as potentially useful, and their analysts had been reviewing the scans of the Defiance, and they were realizing what humans had done, which was create functional faster-than-light technology at a fraction of the development time and resource cost that traditional methods required. Sophie zoomed in on intelligence reports that showed Zaros military analysts discussing the implications of human engineering, and Jake finished her thought by saying that if the Zaros could reverse engineer human methods, they could outfit their entire military with cheap disposable faster-than-light ships and build them by the thousands instead of the hundreds that traditional exotic matter drives required. A chime at the door interrupted their discussion, and Jake called for whoever it was to enter, and Commander Velix came in followed by two beings that Jake hadn't met before, and one was humanoid with crystalline skin that refracted light in rainbow patterns, and the other resembled a floating jellyfish made of liquid mercury that seemed to shift and flow even while remaining in one general shape. Velix made formal introductions, saying that the crystalline being was Counselor Lyra of the Viridian Collective, and the mercury jellyfish was Ambassador Quelm of the Zaros Dominion, and Jake stood up instinctively, straightening his simple uniform, which he knew looked primitive compared to whatever these aliens might be wearing if they wore anything at all. Counselor Lyra spoke first, and her voice sounded like wind chimes as she explained that the Viridian Collective had reviewed the preliminary data on the Defiance, and they wanted to formally invite humanity to join the Galactic Scientific Assembly, because the human approach to engineering represented a paradigm shift that could benefit all species in the galaxy. Jake said that was very generous, but humans barely understood their own technology, so he wasn't sure they were ready to teach anyone else anything, and Lyra's crystalline form seemed to shimmer with what might have been amusement as she said that was precisely why the offer was being made, because sometimes the best innovations came from not knowing what was supposed to be impossible. Ambassador Quelm's translated voice was smooth and oily, as he said that this was exactly why the Zaros Dominion wanted to offer humanity protection, because the galaxy could be dangerous for newcomers, and species with valuable resources often found themselves targets of piracy or exploitation or worse, and the Dominion could ensure Earth's safety and help develop human worlds and provide military support. Sophie asked bluntly what the Dominion wanted in exchange, and Quelm's liquid form rippled as he said the word cooperation and technical exchange and mutual benefit, as if these were perfectly reasonable requests that didn't have any hidden implications. Jake stated plainly that the Zaros wanted human drive technology, and it wasn't a question but a statement of obvious fact, and Quelm's form rippled again as he said, among other things, because humanity had demonstrated remarkable innovation, and the Dominion valued such traits. Commander Velix's mandibles clicked sharply, and he said this was not the appropriate venue for territorial negotiations, because the Defiance was still under Corvani quarantine and protection, and Jake appreciated the intervention, even though he knew it was probably more about Corvani politics than any real concern for human welfare. Quelm said, of course, and he merely wished to extend an offer of friendship and make sure humanity knew it had options in this new galactic community. And then the visitors left, and Jake slumped back into his chair, feeling like he had just survived something dangerous, even though no weapons had been drawn and no threats had been made explicit. Sophie pulled up a new display showing ship movements in the sector over the past 12 hours, and she pointed out that Zaros Dominion vessels had been repositioning throughout the region, and nothing was overtly threatening, but they were clearly forming some kind of perimeter. Jake realized they were being boxed in so the humans couldn't leave without the Zaros tracking them back to Earth. And Sophie asked quietly, what would happen if a Zaros fleet followed them home? And Jake didn't answer immediately because he knew Earth was defenseless by galactic standards. Humanity had exactly one functioning faster-than-light ship, and it was held together with improvised repairs and desperate hope. And if a military empire decided to take what they wanted by force, there would be nothing and no one to stop them from conquering Earth and strip mining human technology, and possibly enslaving or eliminating the entire species. Jake finally said that humans needed allies and they needed them fast. And Sophie suggested the Corvani seemed decent enough. But Jake shook his head and said the Corvani were cautious, and they wouldn't risk a conflict with the Zaros Dominion over a species they had just met, especially when that species might blow themselves up at any moment. He walked to the window and stared out at the dozens of ships docked around the station, and each one was sleek and powerful, and built with the refined technology of civilizations that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years, and somewhere out there in quarantine dock sat one human ship that leaked radiation and defied every law of proper engineering. Jake told Sophie to get him a secure channel to Earth Command and tell them to start building more ships, as many as they could, as fast as they could, and the ships didn't have to be pretty and didn't have to be safe. They just had to work well enough to move through space under their own power. Sophie pointed out that Earth had barely managed to get one ship operational, and building an entire fleet seemed impossible, given their resource constraints and limited understanding of the technology, and Jake interrupted her by saying that building the Defiance had been impossible too, and that had never stopped them before. Sophie smiled grimly and said no, sir. She supposed impossible had never been much of an obstacle for humans, and Jake watched a Zaros Dominion cruiser glide past the station with its sleek lines and obvious weapon systems, and he felt the weight of what was coming. Humanity had announced itself to the galaxy by doing something impossible, and now they would have to keep doing impossible things again and again until either the galaxy accepted them as equals or they went down fighting. And either way, Jake was determined to make sure the galaxy remembered Earth and remembered that humans didn't quit just because something seemed hopeless. Dr. Helen Wright stood in front of the Galactic Scientific Assembly, feeling every bit as out of place as she looked because the assembly hall was a masterpiece of architecture that predated human civilization by thousands of years, and it was a vast sphere where delegates from hundreds of species floated or sat or perched on platforms that were configured for their specific biological needs. And the acoustics were perfect, and the translation systems were flawless, and the collective intelligence in this room could probably solve any theoretical problem in the known universe. High Theorist Crane, who resembled a tree made of living crystal, asked Helen if he understood correctly that she had designed a faster-than-light drive using principles that contradicted 11 fundamental laws of physics and built it from industrial scraps and mining equipment, and her primary qualification was that she had been rejected from every major scientific institution on Earth. Helen adjusted her glasses, which were actual corrective lenses instead of the biological or cybernetic enhancements that most species used, and she confirmed that yes. This was all accurate, though. To be fair, she had also been rejected from several minor institutions as well. And this comment caused a ripple of sound to move through the assembly, which her translator identified as laughter in various forms. Another being that looked like a floating mass of geometric shapes that constantly reconfigured itself declared that this was absurd, because Helen was claiming her mathematics were incorrect, and her theories violated causality, and yet she had achieved what took most species 2,000 years of focused research and development. Helen said yes, that was correct, because she had stopped trying to make her theories fit what physics said should happen, and instead started making them fit what actually happened in her experiments, and this caused the assembly to erupt in debate, with fragments of conversation floating through her translator, about unscientific methodology and dangerous precedents and empirical results without theoretical foundations. Counselor Lyra, who had been observing silently from her crystalline platform, finally spoke, and her voice cut through the chaos like a bell, and she suggested that perhaps Dr. Wright could demonstrate her methodology by attempting to solve a problem that had puzzled the galaxy's greatest minds, and she asked if Helen would be willing to try. Helen felt her stomach drop, because she really wasn't sure this was a good idea since she wasn't actually that smart, compared to the beings in this room who had been studying advanced physics for longer than human civilization had existed, but Lyra was already projecting a holographic equation that filled the center of the sphere. And it was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Lyra explained that this was called the Corvani barrier. And for 3,000 years, the galaxy's scientists had been unable to reconcile quantum entanglement with macro-scale engineering, because the mathematics suggested it should be possible to create instantaneous communication across galactic distances, yet every practical attempt had failed. Helen stared at the equations, feeling completely out of her depth because back on Earth, she had been working with a team of engineers in a converted warehouse and not presenting solutions to the galaxy's greatest scientific minds. But she had come this far by ignoring what she was supposed to do and focusing on what might actually work. She asked if she could have access to the experimental data from all the failed attempts, and suddenly, data streams began flowing into her tablet with thousands of experiments and centuries of accumulated failures, and each one was meticulously documented with every measurement and observation recorded. Helen started scanning through the data looking for patterns, and after 20 minutes she said that their approach was backwards because they were trying to create entanglement at macro scale by scaling up quantum effects, but that wasn't going to work because quantum effects didn't scale linearly and instead they cascaded in unpredictable ways. High theorist Crane said dryly that yes, they were aware of the cascade problem, because they had been attempting to solve it for 3,000 years. And Helen said right, but they were trying to prevent the cascade when maybe they should be using it instead. She pulled up one of the failed experiments and started sketching modifications on the holographic display, and her drawing tools were crude compared to the elegant interfaces the aliens used. But they got the point across, and she explained that every time they tried to entangle large-scale systems, the cascade effect caused decoherence. But decoherence was just information, propagation in an uncontrolled direction. A being made of pure energy stated that controlling the cascade was theoretically impossible, because the cascade was random by definition, but Helen asked if it was really random or just chaotic because there was a difference, and chaos had patterns if you knew how to look for them. She started pulling up data and overlaying failed experiments and looking for correlations, and the assembly watched in fascination as this human scientist, using what they considered primitive analytical tools, began finding patterns in thousands of years of accumulated failures. Helen highlighted a series of experimental results and pointed out that every time the entanglement cascaded, it did so along similar pathways, and the specific path varied, but the topology was consistent, and they weren't seeing random failure, but rather an underlying structure they hadn't mapped yet. Crane objected that this was speculative at best, but Helen said then they should test it, and she started designing a modified experiment on the holographic display. And it was ugly by the assembly standards with brute force approaches where they preferred elegance and approximations where they demanded precision. She told them to run this setup and not try to prevent the cascade, but instead guide it using field geometries that would create channels for the quantum effects to flow through. And it wouldn't be perfect entanglement, but it should give them enough coherence for basic data transmission. Lyra studied the design with her multifaceted perception, and said this would require equipment that didn't exist in the form Helen was describing, and Helen said then they should build it wrong, and use what they had, and improvise, and if it didn't work, they could modify it until it did. The geometric being protested that this wasn't how science worked, and Helen countered that it was how human science worked because the galaxy had spent 3,000 years doing rigorous theoretical research and getting nowhere, so maybe it was time to try sloppy experimental research and see what happened. The assembly debated for another hour with some species arguing that Helen's approach was dangerous and others saying it was at least worth testing. And finally Lyra called for a vote, and by a narrow margin they agreed to construct Helen's experimental setup primarily because they were curious to see what would happen when human methodology met galactic resources. 3 days later, Helen stood in a Viridian research facility, watching technicians assemble her design, and it looked wrong with cables running in inefficient paths, and power regulators pushed beyond their rated capacity, and quantum stabilizers, operating in configurations their designers had never intended. A Viridian technician whose crystalline form refracted light across the workspace reported that the power coupling was stable at 93%, which was below optimal parameters. But Helen said it was fine because they weren't looking for optimal, they were looking for functional. Dr. Shimmer, who was the lead scientist on the project, floated beside Helen and confessed skepticism because the apparatus violated several safety protocols, and Helen agreed that it probably did, but it would either work or it wouldn't, and either way, they would learn something useful. They activated the system, and for a moment nothing happened, and then the cascade began with quantum entanglement spreading through the apparatus in patterns that looked chaotic, but followed the pathways Helen had predicted, and warning alarms started blaring, and several technicians moved to shut down the experiment. Helen told them to wait and give it a second, and the cascade hit the field geometries she had designed, and something remarkable happened, because the chaos didn't disappear, but instead it organized itself, and the wild propagation of entangled states found stable channels and flowed along paths of least resistance that Helen's improvised field generators had created. A signal appeared on the monitoring equipment, and it was garbled and noisy, but it was there, and it was real, and it was instantaneous communication between two entangled systems across the laboratory, and the facility went silent except for the hum of equipment. Dr. Shimmer's bioluminescence pulsed in patterns that Helen had learned meant extreme surprise, and the scientist whispered that the impossible, theoretically unsound, safety-violating experiment had actually worked. Helen grinned and said, "Yeah, it usually did work if you gave it a chance," and news of the successful experiment spread through the Galactic Scientific Assembly faster than the quantum cascade itself, and within hours research teams from dozens of species were requesting collaborations. The Viridian Collective formally invited Helen to join their research division, and even High Theorist Crane sent a message that grudgingly admitted her approach had merit, though he still thought her methodology was chaotic and dangerous. But that evening, as Helen reviewed collaboration proposals in her temporary quarters, Captain Jake Morrison appeared at her door with a grim expression, and he said the Zaros Dominion's third subjugation fleet consisted of 47 warships, and each one was a masterpiece of military engineering that had been refined over 2,000 years of successful conquest, and they approached the Sol system in perfect formation with weapons primed and shields at maximum power, and Admiral Quelm, who commanded from the flagship Inevitable Victory, reviewed the intelligence on humanity one final time. The intelligence reports described a single species that was barely capable of space travel with primitive weapons and no formal military fleet, and their only advantage was an unusual faster-than-light drive design that the Dominion intended to acquire through force if necessary, and Admiral Quelm expected that resistance would be brief and subjugation would be swift and relatively painless for both sides. What Admiral Quelm did not expect was the greeting the fleet received when they arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system, because 23 ships dropped out of warp in a defensive formation, and they were an absolute insult to military aesthetics, with mismatched hulls and visible damage and power signatures that jumped around like dying stars. Several of the human ships were leaking atmosphere through hull breaches that should have been catastrophic, and one ship appeared to be held together primarily by external structural clamps that were never meant to be used as permanent repairs, and they looked less like warships and more like industrial accidents that somehow remained operational. Captain Jake Morrison's voice came through the communication channel clearly, despite the primitive system, and he identified himself as commander of the Terran defense ship Defiance, speaking for the United Earth Coalition and their allies, and he ordered the Zaros fleet to halt their advance and withdraw immediately. Admiral Quelm's liquid form rippled with what might have been amusement as he pointed out that sensors indicated the human vessels were barely functional, and their largest ship had a mass of only 7,000 tons, and there was no possible way they could oppose a military fleet of this size and power. Jake admitted that this was probably true, but said they were going to try anyway because trying impossible things was kind of humanity's specialty, and he gave Admiral Quelm one last chance to turn around and go home, because if the Zaros fleet proceeded, then Earth would interpret it as an act of war. Quelm ended the transmission and told his tactical officer to destroy the lead vessel and show these primitives the futility of resistance and the Inevitable Victory's primary weapons array, which was capable of vaporizing small moons locked onto the Defiance and fired a beam that should have pierced the human ship's hull like it was made of paper. The beam met a shield that flickered into existence, and it wasn't the smooth, stable barrier of proper shield technology, but instead looked like controlled lightning or maybe contained chaos, and the beam scattered in multiple directions, with some being absorbed and some being deflected at random angles, and a portion actually bouncing back toward the Zaros fleet. The tactical officer demanded to know what that defensive system was, and began analyzing the data, which showed that the human shield was using rapidly alternating electromagnetic pulses combined with projected gravitational lensing, and it was incredibly unstable and inefficient, but it was disrupting the beam coherence enough to prevent catastrophic damage. Quelm ordered the fleet to use missiles and kinetic weapons to overwhelm the primitive defenses, and the Zaros ships launched a volley that would have obliterated a small space station. But the human ships responded with a coordinated maneuver that made the Zaros tactical computers crash trying to calculate the flight paths. The human vessels didn't move like military ships that followed predictable attack patterns and defensive formations, but instead they moved like chaos given form, with ships spinning and tumbling and firing thrusters and patterns that seemed random, but somehow kept them just ahead of incoming fire. The human ships fired back with weapons that were as improvised as everything else, including railguns that fired chunks of compressed iron and chemical rockets with nuclear warheads and energy beams that looked like they had been built from industrial cutting lasers, and nothing should have threatened proper military-grade shields. But the humans didn't aim for the Zaros shields, because instead, they aimed for the spaces between ships and detonated warheads to create debris fields, and they fired at angles that forced the Zaros vessels to maneuver into each other's firing solutions, and they used their weapons not to destroy but to disrupt and confuse. The tactical officer reported that this was insane, because the humans were treating the battle like an asteroid mining operation and not proper naval combat, and they were using industrial equipment as weapons, and half their shots were missing deliberately, and he couldn't understand their strategy. Admiral Quelm realized that there was no strategy in the traditional sense, because the humans were improvising, and every ship was acting independently and making decisions based on immediate circumstances instead of following a coordinated battle plan. On the Defiance's bridge, Jake watched the tactical display with satisfaction, as helmsman Pete Donovan grinned and spun the ship through what should have been a collision course with two other human vessels. But at the last second, all three ships fired thrusters and slipped past each other with only meters to spare. Jake asked for a status report on the Zaros command ship, and Lieutenant Sophie Barnes reported that they were confused because their tactical systems assumed predictable opponents, and they were trying to run probability models on human movements, but getting nothing but error messages. Jake said that was good and told his crew to give the Zaros more errors to process, and the battle raged for 3 hours, with the human fleet surviving through pure unpredictability and using maneuvers that looked suicidal, but worked because they were too crazy for enemy computers to predict. The humans survived because when one ship's shields failed, another would spin in to cover them while firing wildly to create a distraction. And they survived because they refused to follow any recognizable pattern of warfare that the Zaros had encountered in 2,000 years of conquest. Slowly and impossibly, the humans were winning not through destroying the enemy, because they had only managed to disable 3 Zaros ships, but through attrition and frustration and pure exhaustion, because the Zaros fleet was burning through fuel reserves trying to target the erratically moving human ships. The Zaros formation was breaking down, and their captains were making mistakes that simply didn't happen in Dominion fleets, because they had never encountered an opponent that refused to fight according to established rules of engagement. Admiral Quelm's second-in-command reported that fuel reserves were at 47%, and the humans were specifically targeting supply ships, and if they continued this engagement, they might not have enough fuel to exit the system safely. Quelm stared at the tactical display showing 23 ships that should have been destroyed in the first 15 minutes, but were somehow still fighting, and still dodging, and still making his professional military fleet look incompetent. He asked for a status report on the human fleet, and his officer said it was difficult to assess because 7 ships appeared to be leaking critical systems, but they remained combat effective, and their largest ship had taken 6 direct hits that should have destroyed it, yet it continued to maneuver on backup power. A new transmission came through, and Jake Morrison's face appeared on the screen looking terrible, with blood on his uniform, and burns on his face, and smoke visible in the background. but he was smiling like someone who had just won something important. Jake said he thought it was time to discuss terms because Admiral Quelm had seen what humans could do when defending their home, and he should imagine what they would do if forced to take the fight to Zaros territory. Quelm objected that the human ships were barely functional and moments from complete failure, but Jake pointed out that human ships were always moments from complete failure, because that was how they operated, and they had been flying these disasters for months and knew exactly how much damage they could take. Jake explained that humans were very comfortable operating right at the edge of catastrophic failure, and asked what terms Quelm wanted, and the Admiral's Advisory Council was flashing urgent recommendations because the engagement had already cost more resources than projected. The mathematics of conquest no longer favored continuation, because Earth possessed no resources that justified this level of expenditure, and the humans had proven they would not submit easily to superior force. Jake's terms were simple, and he said the Zaros should leave and tell the Dominion that Earth was off limits and spread the word that humanity wasn't worth the trouble to conquer, and in exchange humans wouldn't reverse engineer Zaros weapons or hunt down supply lines or start showing other species how to build cheap, effective warships. Quelm understood then what the Dominion's intelligence had missed completely, because humans weren't primitive, but rather unorthodox, and they weren't weak but unpredictable, and they couldn't be defeated by conventional superiority, because they refused to fight conventionally. The Admiral agreed that the Dominion would withdraw but warned that this wasn't over, because the galaxy would not tolerate disruption of the established order indefinitely, but Jake replied that it was a good thing humans were really bad.